The Imperial Japanese Navy destroyer Kikuzuki was a sharp tactical problem for the United States Pacific Fleet. She was a Mutsuki-class warship built to emphasize fast, hard torpedo attacks, strike quickly, then vanish before an enemy formation could organize a clean counterblow. On May 4, 1942, a massive strike package launched from the aircraft carrier United States ship Yorktown located the vessel at anchor in the Solomon Islands. The aircraft descended upon the anchorage at Tulagi and executed a coordinated attack. In the chaos of the strike, the destroyer was hit, wartime reports variously describing bomb and torpedo damage, ripping open her hull. The blast was reported to have killed about 12 crewmen and left the ship's structure badly compromised. This single violent event triggered a cascade of mechanical failures that would eventually hand the United States Navy one of the most critical intelligence prizes of the Pacific War. At about 336 feet in length, the Kikuzuki was not just another standard surface combatant. She was a fast and heavily armed delivery system constructed specifically to deploy advanced Japanese torpedo technology. Allied commanders were already watching Japanese torpedoes run faster, farther, and with more punch than any pre-war estimate allowed. Pinning down the hard physical limits of those weapons became a supreme strategic priority. The sinking of this particular vessel near Tulagi in Halavo Bay off Florida Island presented an exceptionally rare opportunity for direct hardware analysis. If naval intelligence teams could physically examine the firing tubes, the loading mechanisms, and the structural interfaces bolted to her deck, they could begin to lock down hard mechanical limits, dimensions, mounting geometry, and what size weapons those systems could physically accept. The immediate problem for the Japanese crew was that their heavily armed asset was rapidly filling with seawater. The aerial torpedo impact had completely compromised the starboard side plating. The ocean rushed into the lower engineering spaces, immediately destroying the delicate balance of buoyancy that kept the heavy steel hull afloat. In a desperate attempt to save the ship, the surviving crew secured a tow line from an auxiliary subchaser and dragged the heavily listing warship toward the nearby shoreline. They managed to push the bow into the shallow mud, temporarily halting the downward plunge of the vessel. For a brief window of time, the Kikuzuki sat beached and bleeding fuel into the tidal flats. When the United States Navy eventually seized control of the Tulagi operational area, they discovered the wrecked warship. The intelligence mandate handed down to the salvage engineers was absolute and uncompromising. The site was classified as a high-priority target for immediate recovery. The objective was not the restoration of the hull for future service, but strictly the extraction of the mechanical secrets locked inside her upper superstructure. Every day the warship remained submerged in the warm and corrosive saltwater of the South Pacific meant a slow degradation of the precise mechanical tolerances the engineering teams desperately needed to measure. Corrosion would slowly eat away at the crucial evidence, erasing the exact dimensions of the torpedo tubes. They had to get the ship out of the water to conclusively prove the exact threat profile of the Japanese surface fleet. The engineers knew that raising a wreck in a forward combat zone would demand immense effort with almost no heavy industrial gear to spare. They had to assess the structural stability of a shattered warship resting precariously on an unfamiliar shoreline. Naval salvage operates on strict principles of mass, gravity, and displaced volume. And the ocean rarely surrenders a ruined vessel without exacting a heavy toll on the men trying to raise it. The wrecked destroyer was a pristine intelligence asset, but first it had to hold together long enough for salvage to even begin. The beach looked like refuge, but its slope was a trap. By driving the bow into the mud, the crew bought a few hours, yet gravity kept dragging the flooded stern down the incline while the tide rose and fell under the forward keel. With roughly 1,772 tons of steel and machinery on that gradient, the ship was fighting pure geometry. Sooner or later, the mud would lose its grip, and the stern would pull her backward into deeper water. That certainty came from what the blast did to the ship's balance. A high explosive rupture on the starboard side amidships flooded the engineering spaces, the hollow volume that carried both power and buoyancy. In a destroyer, that midsection is the load-bearing span. Once seawater replaces air there, lift vanishes and the hull begins to settle and shear under its own weight. By nightfall, the Kikuzuki's stern was no longer just damaged, it was becoming an anchor, and the crew had only hours to keep the forward compartments alive. The Japanese damage control teams fought desperately through the night to reinforce the forward bulkheads, attempting to isolate the massive influx of seawater and preserve what little buoyancy remained. They needed to stabilize the intact internal volume to keep the flooded stern from acting as a massive anchor, dragging them entirely into the abyss. However, their portable pumps could not match the sheer volume of the Pacific Ocean, forcing its way through the shattered starboard plating. The next day, the tide ultimately sealed the fate of the ruined warship. On May 5th, the incoming high tide generated just enough lift on the lightly loaded bow to break the friction of the coastal mud. Without the physical grip of the shallows to hold her in place, the immense weight of the flooded engineering spaces overpowered the remaining friction and pulled the entire hull backward into the channel. The warship slid completely off the beach profile and accelerated backward into deeper water. She plummeted stern first into the dark harbor, coming to rest with a violent shudder as her aft section slammed deep into the muddy seafloor. The ocean quickly swallowed the main deck, leaving only the very top of the forward superstructure, the bridge, and the sheer tip of the bow breaking the surface. The geometry trap was now fully sprung. The vessel was no longer floating or even partially buoyant. She was a shattered, dead-weight steel carcass tightly gripped by the intense suction of the harbor bottom. Any future attempt to recover the vital intelligence locked inside the submerged armament would have to overcome a hull pinned by flooded compartments and dense mud. That seabed hold added enormous resistance to any vertical pull. Standard naval salvage doctrine required heavy floating cranes and massive pontoon rigs to break that kind of profound seabed grip. But the Pacific operational theater was entirely stripped bare of such specialized heavy industrial equipment. The massive warship was pinned to the mud, requiring a brute force lifting mechanism the United States Navy simply did not possess in the forward operating area. The fundamental currency of any marine salvage operation is displaced volume. If an engineer can artificially generate enough empty space beneath the surface of the ocean, the surrounding water pressure will fight to push that void upward toward the sky. In 1943, the United States Navy desperately needed to harness this exact physical principle in the remote waters of the Solomon Islands. The deep mud of the harbor held a prized Japanese warship in an iron grip. The strategic imperative required extracting this vessel, but the combat zone lacked the massive floating cranes standard to stateside naval yards. The solution would require extreme combat engineering and the raw application of buoyancy. The responsibility for this massive extraction fell to the crew of the fleet tug United States ship Menominee, working alongside whatever salvage crews and improvised gear the forward area could assemble. They arrived in the forward operating area to find the shattered destroyer resting heavily on the coastal slope, its stern completely swallowed by the dark water. The structural voiding from the initial torpedo blast had replaced the hollow engineering spaces with dense seawater, transforming the lower half of the hull into an unyielding anchor. The tug possessed powerful diesel engines designed for open ocean towing, but it simply did not have the sheer vertical lifting capacity required to break the suction of the mud. To pull the warship up the steep shoreline profile, as they first had to lift the dead weight of the steel off the seafloor. Lacking purpose-built heavy lift vessels, the salvage team scrounged the harbor for any available displacement asset. They located a heavy steel barge and pressed it into service as the mechanical heart of an improvised pontoon lift. The technique relied on sacrificing the buoyancy of a surface craft to capture a submerged wreck. The engineers deliberately flooded the barge's compartments, letting it sink deep into the water directly over the destroyer. Divers then descended into the murky harbor and passed heavy chains under the belly of the sunken warship. They hauled the rigging tight and secured it firmly to the flooded barge above. Once the mechanical connection between the two vessels was locked tight, the crew activated high-capacity salvage pumps. As the pumps evacuated the seawater from the barge, the internal compartments filled with air, instantly restoring the displaced volume. The ocean relentlessly forced the lightning barge toward the surface. Because the steel chains possessed zero slack, the tremendous upward thrust of the barge transferred directly into the ruined warship. The restored buoyancy literally tore the destroyer slightly off the harbor bottom, temporarily breaking the severe suction of the deep mud. With the massive hull suspended just inches above the seafloor, the actual extraction could finally begin. Using heavy shore winches and the immense pulling power of the Menominee, the salvage crew dragged the suspended wreck forward. They moved the ship horizontally toward the shallows until the hull once again grounded out against the rising incline of the shoreline profile. The team then slacked the chains, flooded the barge to lower it back down, tightened the rigging, and pumped the barge dry to initiate another lift. This exhaustive cycle of flooding, lifting, and dragging turned the extraction into an agonizing foot-by-foot crawl up the underwater slope. The discontinuous operation required immense patience and brute physical labor from the dive teams working in the hazardous shallows. Day after day, the improvised mechanical sequence successfully wrestled the massive steel carcass closer to the surface. The continuous resetting of heavy ground tackle tested the limits of the makeshift rigging and the endurance of the deck crews. The rigging held, and the ship began to inch toward the beach, but the seabed itself soon halted the entire operation. Destroying a vital structural component of a recovered vessel usually contradicts the fundamental goal of marine salvage. But when the sheer physical mass of the ocean floor permanently halts an extraction, engineers must rapidly decide between preserving the entire flooded hull or sacrificing its lower appendages to secure the primary intelligence asset. The dragging operation had successfully moved the shattered Japanese destroyer out of the deepest water of the harbor, but the steady forward momentum suddenly stopped dead. The thick steel cables stretching to the heavy shoreline winches strained to their absolute breaking limits, groaning under the immense tension. Out on the water, the massive diesel engines of the towing vessel roared against what felt like an immovable, solid force. The massive warship was refusing to yield another inch. The sudden resistance was not coming from the dead weight of the seawater still trapped inside the compromised hull. It was coming directly from the underwater geometry of the ship itself. Mud drag resistance occurs when dragging a heavy, submerged object along the seafloor creates exponentially increasing friction as protruding appendages dig deep into the silt. The massive twin bronze propellers of the destroyer were originally engineered to bite into the water and push thousands of tons of steel across the ocean surface. Now, dragged backward and upward along a steep coastal incline, those same enormous blades were acting like massive plows driving deeply into the solid earth. Instead of sliding smoothly over the submerged slope, the sharp angles of the heavy propellers and their rigid support shafts caught the dense mud, acting like massive steel anchors fighting every pound of horizontal pulling force. Every time the exhausted dive teams executed another arduous pontoon barge lift, the forward section of the wreck would rise slightly, but the stern stayed buried in the trench behind it. The immense physical friction of the seabed was now far greater than the combined horizontal pulling power of the shore winches and the surface tug. The entire salvage operation faced a total, critical failure point. The stop-and-start lift had already drained men and machinery alike. The grueling forward combat zone deployment had stretched across months of continuous, dangerous physical labor. The military engineers could not simply abandon the primary intelligence prize sitting just below the surface merely because the lower hull geometry was fighting the extraction. The brutal physical reality of the harbor bottom demanded a radical and highly destructive trade-off. The absolute intelligence mandate required the untouched torpedo hardware located high on the upper decks, not the shattered propulsion system currently buried deep in the mud. To save the mission, the salvage master ordered the heavy dive teams into the murky, hazardous water with an extreme objective. The divers descended to the flooded stern and went to work on the problem that had paralyzed the entire pull. Whatever was biting into the mud, twisted stern gear, bent supports, or broken appendages, had to be cleared or removed so the hull could slide instead of plow. With that drag reduced, the heavy shoreline winches engaged once again, and the massive, ruined steel carcass finally broke free from the deep trench, inching forward toward the shallows without the brutal, paralyzing friction holding it back. The extreme measure had successfully saved the mission, turning a disastrous mechanical stalemate into hard-won forward progress. The final, agonizing pull up the shoreline profile could resume, but the hull still had to be drained. When a submerged warship is dragged up a steep coastal incline, there is a narrow window of opportunity that dictates whether the vessel will ever float again. The physical mechanics of the salvage operation shift drastically the moment the highest steel structures of the shattered hull breach the surface of the ocean. The agonizing crawl from the deep water had successfully positioned the ruined Japanese destroyer in the shallow mud of the tidal zone. For months, the salvage teams had relied entirely on raw exterior lifting force to wrestle the dead mass up the slope, executing one grueling pontoon barge lift after another. But the sheer pulling power of the heavy shoreline winches and surface tugs was no longer sufficient. To fully recover the ship, the engineers had to transition from dragging the dead weight to actually restoring the internal buoyancy of the heavily flooded hull. The timing was critical, as the teams had to capitalize on the lowest point of the local tide to expose as much of the damaged steel as possible. The magnitude of the trapped seawater presented a staggering obstacle for the recovery crews. At full operational load, the vessel displaced 1,772 tons. The vast majority of that weight currently consisted of the Pacific Ocean sitting stagnant inside the shattered engineering spaces and darkened lower compartments. A vessel cannot be safely towed across open water if its internal spaces remain completely flooded. The salvage master recognized that bringing the massive steel carcass fully back to life required an overwhelming pumping capacity and rapid structural patching. In October 1943, the operation escalated from a purely nautical recovery into a major industrial construction effort. Seabees from a naval construction unit moved onto the shoreline to support the dewatering and patching work, and the 34th Naval Construction Battalion would photograph the destroyer once she was back afloat. The arrival of the Heavy Construction Battalion transformed the beach into a loud, frantic industrial zone. The Seabees waded into the surf, carrying heavy gasoline-powered salvage pumps, thick rubber discharge hoses, and vast quantities of heavy lumber and steel plating. Their primary objective was to rapidly seal the massive ruptures in the starboard side before the shifting tides could flood the compartments back to their maximum capacity. Working waist-deep in oil-slicked water, the damage control teams bolted heavy steel patches over the jagged blast holes and wedged thick timber shores against the weakened interior bulkheads. They had to create a watertight perimeter strong enough to withstand the immense external pressure of the ocean once the interior water level began to drop. If the shoring failed during the pumping process, the external water pressure would instantly crush the weakened bulkheads and send the ship straight back to the bottom. As the heavy wooden shoring locked firmly into place, the Seabees fired up the massive array of salvage pumps. Thick streams of dark, foul seawater blasted out of the discharge hoses and splashed back into the harbor. Inside the hull, the waterline began to fall fast. The mathematics of displacement finally shifted in favor of the salvage engineers. As hundreds of tons of dead-weight seawater were forcefully ejected from the hull, the natural buoyancy of the destroyer returned. The shattered keel, trapped in the mud for over a year, suddenly shuddered and tore free from the seabed. The massive warship rose out of the shallows and settled heavily into a stable, floating trim. She was heavily scarred, coated in thick marine growth, and permanently crippled, but she was entirely free of the ocean floor. The combined brute force of the fleet, tugs, the heavy winches, and the aggressive pumping operation had successfully resurrected the ruined vessel. The destroyer was finally afloat, no longer a salvage nightmare, but a disarmed specimen in shallow water ready for dissection. 24 inches represents a profound leap in naval lethality. When a torpedo tube diameter increases from standard 21-inch Allied variants to 24 inches, the internal volume available to the weapon rises dramatically. That extra space can support a larger warhead and more room for the fuel and oxidizer that drive the torpedo's engine. This single-dimensional measurement instantly rewrites the mathematical boundaries of surface combat, dictating a longer effective striking range and a significantly more devastating blast yield. United States Navy intelligence officers did not need to guess at these parameters anymore. The ruined Japanese warship, brought into Purvis Bay and allowed to settle in shallow water, offered complete, unobstructed access to the enemy surface fleet's primary striking weapon. The shattered destroyer was no longer a menace to Allied shipping, but a completely disarmed mechanical specimen ready for dissection. Technical exploitation occurs when captured enemy hardware is physically measured to determine mechanical constraints, hard limits that cut through rumor and guesswork. It does not hand you every performance number in a single moment, but it forces the intelligence picture to change. By placing steel calipers directly onto the firing tubes bolted to the upper deck, the engineers bypassed wartime propaganda, battlefield estimates, and panicked survivor reports. They extracted cold, verifiable data. The vessel was stabilized on heavy wooden keel blocks, completely isolated from the relentless interference of the ocean tide. While the shipwrights surveyed the deformed lower hull to assess structural shear, the intelligence teams fixed their attention on the armament and mounts above the main deck. They climbed the slanted, damaged steel to reach the twin rotating mounts that housed the heavy weapons. The intelligence teams swarmed the heavy armament installations. They meticulously stripped away the thick marine growth, hardened oil, and heavy mud from the steel mechanisms. They examined the heavy gearing that rotated the mounts outboard, assessing the traverse speed and the firing angles available to the enemy crew. But their primary objective remained the definitive measurement of the inner diameter of the launch tubes. The engineers locked their heavy steel calipers into place inside the empty cylinders, reading the final, undeniable measurement. The bore measured exactly 24 inches. This single physical confirmation provided the ultimate proof that the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed a heavily armed delivery system, far exceeding standard Allied naval specifications. Tube diameter was the hard gate. It set the maximum body size, the fittings, and the mounting geometry a weapon had to match. It could not reveal propulsion chemistry or engine design, but it erased any doubt about the scale of the threat, and it forced Allied doctrine to adjust immediately. A larger torpedo tube necessitates a heavier weapon, which mathematically dictates a fundamentally different threat profile on the open ocean. The Allied surface fleet could no longer rely on pre-war engagement ranges or outdated defensive assumptions. If a standard enemy destroyer could launch a 24-inch weapon, the Allied cruisers and battleships had to engage enemy formations from significantly further away to remain completely outside the lethal strike radius. The entire defensive posture of the Pacific Fleet had to shift based on the strict geometric reality of those steel tubes. The grueling, highly hazardous combat salvage operation delivered what the strategists needed most: a single, verifiable number cut from steel. The men who wrestled the shattered steel carcass out of the deep mud had successfully bypassed the immense physical barriers of the coastal environment to deliver an intelligence asset. The absolute intelligence mandate established months earlier was fulfilled in part because the tube diameter was only the beginning of the story. Fleet staffs could begin integrating the 24-inch parameter into their threat assessments, tightening ranges and revisiting assumptions even as the full performance picture of the weapon continued to come into focus over time.